Insomnia at its core is really about fear and anxiety, which is why so many of the quick fixes or the solutions out there don't actually help. Welcome to the Hopeful Mind. I'm Michelle. I'm a sleep coach, and I'm here to help you step out of the struggle with chronic insomnia and anxiety. So one way to think of insomnia is thinking of it as sleep anxiety. And so just knowing that at its core, it's not really about your sleep. I know it can feel as though you've lost the ability to sleep or that something is broken inside, but this is never the case. This is not actually what's going on. I understand feeling that way because I felt that way too when I was going through insomnia. I was terrified that my ability to sleep was gone, that essentially that part of me and my body was just broken. But this is never the case. And I know exactly how hard it is to believe that and to be going through this. And as hard as it is to go through insomnia at a physical level, it's very, very difficult mentally and emotionally to be going through this. I would argue the hardest part is actually the mental and emotional part of insomnia. So I'm glad that you're here. Oftentimes, insomnia is triggered by something that creates a sleepless night or some kind of sleep disruption that you wouldn't normally have. Maybe it's travel, it could be work stress, a fight with your partner, it could be anything. But something happens that disturbs your sleep in a way that you're not used to. And typically what starts to happen is maybe not on the first night, but maybe the second night when you expect for things to get back on track, and maybe they don't. But at some point, as your sleep has been disturbed, you start to really worry about it. You start to worry about it, you start to focus on it, and you start to feel anxious about what's happening with your sleep. And it sort of begins to become this cycle where the less you sleep, the more you worry, the more you're focused on your sleep, the more you try to control and get your sleep back on track. And of course, the less you sleep. And then of course, the less you sleep, the more you worried and feel afraid. And the more you try to control your sleep. And then the less you sleep. And this cycle starts to begin that you don't even realize that you're in this cycle necessarily. And this is typically how insomnia starts for all of us, is there's something at the beginning that triggers it, that creates that initial sleep disruption. But really what comes next is that we start to really worry about our sleep. And once we're worried, we start to feel more anxious. We start to try to control our sleep. And for all of you out there who have ever tried to control your sleep and to try harder to make yourself sleep, you know that this only backfires and that the harder you try, the less you sleep. And yet it feels like we must somehow, of course, do something, right, when we're in this situation. So we tend to try harder and harder, and it just leads into more of this cycle. And so the sleep part of it, the fact that we're not sleeping well, it becomes the focus when really sleep is a surface symptom with insomnia. And really the core issue is the anxiety underneath it that is driving it, right? Think of sleep as something that requires surrender and this felt sense of safety. But when we're anxious about it, and trying to make it happen, our system is being signaled that there's a threat happening. And so we're not sleeping. And so over time, as we are experiencing this, what starts to happen is that our brain and our body starts to learn fear about the insomnia experience, right? At first, we're worried, we're afraid, but over time, as we're going through this, our brain and our body learns the fear. It starts to associate being awake at night and certain symptoms the next day. It starts to associate the whole insomnia experience with danger. And then it starts to anticipate that danger. So you might, for example, feel really sleepy while you're watching your favorite show on the couch, and then you go to bed and you're wide awake and your heart is pounding and you're sweating and you're thinking, what is going on? And so insomnia is really a conditioned fear response. Conditioned just meaning that it's been learned. And your brain and body is expecting danger as you go to bed at night. And it's creating this hyperarousal response in response to perceiving a threat. And it's actually trying to keep you safe. So insomnia is really this misguided protection mechanism, right? Think of it as almost like a false alarm that's going off, telling you, hey, danger, right? There's a threat here. And your brain might not exactly understand the exact threat. All it knows is that nighttime starts to feel dangerous. It starts to feel like a time that your brain and body needs to protect you from. And of course, as this is happening and we go into, the next difficult night, we respond the way any person would. And we typically respond with a lot of extra fear and reactivity and resistance and attempts to control all of that. I know I personally was in that cycle for years when I was going through insomnia. And it actually feels, when you're in that, like it feels like you're fighting for your life, right? It's really scary because it all feels very dangerous. And even though insomnia is a safe experience, it feels incredibly dangerous. So the more we're in it, the more scared we feel, the more we fight, the more we try to control our sleep, and the more all of that ends up unintentionally fueling more insomnia, because it just keeps our brain and our body scared and perceiving being awake at night as a threat, right? Perceiving the symptoms that we could be having, or the thoughts we could be having, or the emotions like fear, perceiving all of that as this ongoing threat. And the more we try to avoid or fight or not experience it, the more we are unintentionally teaching our brain and body to stay scared. Because look at how hard we're working to not experience it. So it must be very dangerous. And so this is the cycle that we can get into with insomnia. And all too often, right, we might be going to see our doctors and our practitioners, which is always a good thing to be doing, but we might be told, that they don't know what's going on, or you might be given, let's say, a sleep medication or something of this nature. And a lot of the times that doesn't work very much. So the solutions we're given when we're going through this don't tend to be that helpful, because they tend to be really focused on sleep and trying to control sleep. And sleep is not something that we can directly control the way we wish we could. And for those of you who have ever tried, you might really understand this. This experience of really seeing that the harder you're trying, probably the less that you're sleeping, not more. And so we can get into these patterns of, again, really trying to control and fix and fight. And this whole time, it's really fueling more anxiety, more of that conditioned arousal response that we're in, because we're not approaching insomnia through the lens of anxiety and understanding conditioned fear responses. Once we start to understand insomnia, not as a sleep problem, and really as anxiety and that conditioned arousal or conditioned fear response that's happening in the background, then we can actually start to understand insomnia. We can start to work with it differently. And that's when you can start to experience some really big shifts and changes when it comes to your recovery. Great. I hope today helped. And if it did, I'd love to ask you to subscribe as I grow this community. I'd really love you to be a part of it. and I look forward to seeing you next time.